morning, ladies and gentlemen. For those people who know me, I like to move around the stage a little bit, and following Jason and Tom, it's a fairly serious set of credentials I have to follow, so I'll try and be a little bit dynamic. Three things: I'm now a consultant, and a really good mentor said to me, you have to buy a suit, get a logo, and learn to think again. I've done the first two, and hopefully after that we'll see whether I've done the third at the end of this presentation. So there's a lot of things happening in the industry, and I couldn't agree more with what Jason and Tom have said. The red meat industry is becoming a much more sophisticated, highly integrated set of value chains. Producers need to operate within those value chains, and I think that's the big key cultural change that producers will have to get used to, is that we have to change our way of thinking. We're not just producing one particular product at one particular point in the supply chain, we're producing a product that goes all the way across that sophisticated value chain. And what decisions we make and who we make those decisions for are going to have to be there. The other thing that's emerging is, and I think a really quantum shift, as Tom said, he puts up a slide nowadays of about 10 or 15 different brands. Consumers appreciate those brands and they expect those brands. So as producers and as seed stock breeders, instead of breeding for a market, instead of breeding for a particular breed, we're going to be much more focused around breeding for a brand. Now, breeding for a brand is a very different dynamic in the Australian beef and sheep industry, because brand has a totally different connotation in terms of what you have to deliver. So successful producers will manage and utilise that information. We have to embrace technology changes. So, working in an industry where we have traditionally been a little bit conservative, how do we get on top of that? And we're going to have to challenge the real fundamental beliefs behind livestock production. And that's the basis of value chain competition, and that's the basis of how we're going to have to move forward. So what's going to be ahead for the industries as we see it? Changing consumer preferences is placing a different value on breed. So no longer do we expect breed to have some of the connotations that we had before, because now I can go into the northern beef industry and I can put a particular breed across all of the northern beef herd, and suddenly the quality issue that was there for the last 30 or 40 years is going to be removed in one generation. So how does that change southern production? Because in southern production, I've had the luxury in the beef production system of having an eating quality differential. But with the change that's happening in the north, I now no longer can compete with that, and I'll be competing on a cost production basis. So that's going to change. That's the evolving, disruptive technologies that are coming into place. We're going to see much more information flow, and I couldn't agree more with Tom. We've wasted so much time thinking about how do we actually control data, how do we protect data, how do we actually stop someone else using our data, and the reality is we'll only get benefit out of data if someone else is using it for us. So there's a big change that's going to come in there, and value chains are demanding a whole range of different sectors. So if you're going to get paid in the value chain, you're going to have to be delivering an article that adds value to that value chain. And as Jason said before, we've bred better bulls, but do better bulls actually add value to the value chain? And are you expected to get paid for that? There's a whole lot of changes they're going to make, and as a result, the sires of the future are going to become much more focused on the genes, much more focused on what the individual animal can potentially carry, much more focused on the compliance, and as the processing sector would say, it's the lack of compliance that affects their profitability rather than the top end. And as Tom showed, if you drop off the bottom 5% or the bottom 10%, you change the distribution and the value across the whole lot of animals by $30 or $40. Getting rid of that non-compliance is far more valuable than actually achieving the top end. And that's a real quantum shift. The other area is much more focused on brands. So sires for markets, sires for brands are going to have to come into that. And the weakest point in any particular production system is the lowest point of that production system. So we'll see some changes. So Rob and Ben will talk a little bit about the theory of genetic gain later on. People would know that the rate of genetic gain, so the rate of genetic gain that we get in the beef and the sheep meat industries, and I think David and Richard and Michael said we want to double it, is equal to selection intensity by selection accuracy divided by the generation interval. Well, I actually fell asleep halfway through some of the infamous Dr. Banks talks, so I actually started to think about that the rate of genetic gain is actually quite different to what the theory tells us. The rate of genetic gain is actually the consumer requirements or the brand requirements divided by client perceptions and the discount across market signals, right? And I'll challenge that all the way through to show that's exactly what's happening in our industry at the moment. And here's a really good example. Current dilemmas of breeding. So that's the brand-focused breeding. There's the specifications that particular supply chain was given. 280 to 340 kilo carcass weight, rib fat 5 to 20, lean meat yield 58.5 to 64.5, meat colour 1B to 4, marbling 2 plus, MSA index 61.5. That makes sense, doesn't it? Everybody works that out. What sort of bull should I breed for that? So imagine my surprise when a really good mate of mine from Central Queensland rang up and said, "This is the bull I've just bought, tell me what you think." So after several rums, I rang him back and said, "Well, I think he might have a bit of growth if he's big." I was sort of guessing that. Packed full of muscle with no wastage, so maybe he's got a little bit of yield. He's loose in the skin with his true size head. Well, I haven't got no idea what that means. He's got a great top line and walks true, so he's got 4 legs, I think. His mother's an excellent cow, produced 3 bulls previously, sold to 15,000, so there obviously something must be there. And he's highly recommended for commercial cattlemen who want to breed front paddock cattle. So everybody's got a front paddock, I take it. So tell me, what is the connection between perceptive breeding and brand-focused breeding? Right? So how do we actually change the culture of that? And then we see what traits are valued and where. So we look at the consumer, and I work from the consumer backwards. Their value is driven by quality, cut size and appearance. Right, that makes sense. That's what consumers really want. So then you go back to the brand owner and they talk about weight, yield, quality and cut type. Then you go to producer and the list starts getting longer. Breed, fertility, survival, growth, carcass, disease, efficiency, quality. Then you go back to the breeder, breed type, fertility, growth, size, structure, quality, traits as before. Right, so the consumer's only interested in about 3 or 4 things in that value chain, and the breeder is worried about 30 or 40 different things to make a profit. Right, so you get this total disconnect between market signals. And what you start to find is you actually start to get what I call value chain orphans. Right? And the cow-calf or the store lamb producer at the moment is a value chain orphan. They're selecting on breed, fertility, survival, early growth, disease, efficiency, mature cow size. Because they're selling all of their weaners or all of their store lambs, what signals do they get in the current marketplace for quality? They get none. Look at the list that they've got and relate that to the consumer. Can anybody see any connection between what a cow-calf producer and a store lamb producer is doing relative to a consumer? There is absolutely no linkages between those sets. So in the current system where information flow is not going back to the cow-calf producer, they actually sit as a value chain orphan. They've got no idea what they're producing. Right? And that is a real key dilemma that the industries face at the moment. So then we get into the languages being used. And I heard David Crombie spoke before about getting consistent languages. I put this slide up a while ago. In the seed stock industry, we measure ultrasound IMF. We adjust that to a constant carcass weight. We've got limited progeny testing, but we're going to start to see a bit of a change in genomics. Then we go through to the producer. Now the producer buys that bull or that ram that's got IMF. They've got no live measures. They've got grass versus grain. And when they actually sell their animal, they actually get back either an OzMeat or an MSA marble score. So how do they relate that to the IMF percentage in ultrasound? Pretty hard to do. Then you go to the processor. They've got OzMeat and MSA. They're measuring in only one muscle, so the correlation is not 1 between the 2 traits, and they're not really sure about what that IMF on the bulls that their clients are using actually relates to them. Then you go to the brand owner, and this is where it becomes really interesting. Great MSA system out there and there, but the real key thing is most people still sell on marbling. And again, only in one cut, and again, uses OzMeat in marbling. But the real interesting thing was you use OzMeat marbling, but we use the MSA marbling score in the index. So already we get a disconnect there. Then we go to the consumer, and they visually see a bit of marbling. They know tenderness is associated with IMF, and you go around in that whole circle. Now, can anybody tell me what the relationship is between marbling in a piece of steak and bull IMF is? Right? And that, Rob Banks is nodding, but very few people can see that. And I get that all the time in both sheep and beef and say, righto, if that bull's got an IMF of +2, does that mean that he's going to breed progeny that've got a marbling of +2? And the answer is sometimes, right? And that's the reality of the situation. And here's an example in the sheep industry. And again, I walked in to buy a merino ram a couple of weeks ago. I happened to walk in near the end of a different sale, and the breeder came up and said, no, I haven't worked in lamb plan for 10 or 15 years. He said, see, I told you lamb plan didn't work. Here's two examples. Ram A, right, 11 for post-weaning weight, plus 2.6 for post-weaning eye muscle depth, minus 58 for worm resistance, so fantastic sheep, on 144 index, and he only made $1,100. And Ram B, he's 17.5 for growth, he's 1.9 for muscle, same WEC, and he's 130 on the index, and he made $1,850. So here's two rams, one's got much lower index, but you actually see a completely different profit margin. And I said, well, hang on, let's have a look at the value chain. So the value chain says that that top ram should have actually delivered to the whole value chain $1,400 more. But the problem is in the sheep industry at the moment, every single processor just has a flat grid. It's all about weight, and you can supply anything from an 18 to a 32 kilo carcass, fat score 0 to 5, and get no penalties at all. So in the reality, the bottom ram actually makes more for that producer because that's the market signal they're getting back. So the differential between that of nearly $3,459 is the differential between what happens if you've got true market signals in a value chain versus what we're currently seeing with a grid-based structure. So we've got a huge lot of cultural differences and industry structural issues to emerge even before we start to get a look at that. The real challenge for me looking at those particular numbers is that bottom ram is minus 1.1 for IMF, so in the bottom 1%, and he's +4 for shear force, so basically anybody got R.M. Williams boots on, righto, leather-soled shoes, take your leather-soled shoes, have a chew, that's about where a +4 actually sits, righto? Again, in the worst 1%. So here's that person paid basically $750 more for a ram that's actually going to produce progeny that go into a supply chain that ultimately when that consumer eats it, they're going to say, well, that was a pretty ordinary piece of lamb, right? And yet the actual breeder got rewarded for selling that producer the ram. Do the market signals make sense? No. So the cultural has to change in that area. And here's again, consumer versus client within a value chain. A little bit of work I've been doing, Osmeat marbling versus MSA index, key processor, 6 months kill data. Basically wanted to set up a brand, and they're very, very well structured. They said we want above 60 for the MSA index, and we want our marbling score above 2, righto? So that makes sense. 8% of the animals were above 60, but had less than a marbling score 2. So what do I do with those high quality animals that have really good consumer outcomes, but aren't meeting the client requirements? More importantly, in that particular data set, 32% of the animals were above 2, but had less than 60. Right? So in that sense, the client was expecting a marble score above 2, but the consumer would see that meet as below 60, saying, well, is that really a better than everyday product? So here we have two different market signals, and I'm still struggling with working in this supply chain. Should the genetic program focus on the MSA index, or should the genetics program focus on marbling? And how do we get those signals right? And then when you go to a real market change situation, here's a particular breed that I had the great privilege of working with. They sell about 8,400 bulls. At the moment, they select about 285 sires, about 3%. The top 5% of the sires, if you were a value chain, would average 117 on the index. The average of sires selected in that particular breed was actually 79. So you've got a whole heap of breeders out there making their own informed selection decisions, and that's the reality of what happened. The differential is $38, right, per bull. Now, if you multiply that across a cow, then you multiply that by across the number of commercial bulls those sires will be producing, then you multiply it by the commercial steers, both direct and from daughters. Somewhere across that value chain, that decision of operating the difference between a value chain and a group of informed stud breeders is costing the industry $5,460,000. Right? So who's paying the result of $1,700 a bull? And maybe industry has worked that out. But who in the supply chain or the value chain is actually paying that $5 million loss? Righto? Who is doing that? And our market force is working exceptionally well. And again, changing the technology. Ben and Rob will talk about the implementation of single step and the change that genomics will make and the value the commercial data will come forward. But here's a challenge for industry. Again, a cultural shift. I'm working with this particular breed. They're a modern sheep breed. They've got about 15,000 ewes. They work at the moment. They produce 17,000 lambs. They actually 8,750 ram and ewe lambs. That makes sense. They scan about 70% of them, of the rams, 50% of the ewes. It's about 10,000 lambs all scanned. And the cost of scanning is about $5. So they invest about $52,000 to get their carcass traits, right? And there's about 40 or 50 breeders in this particular breed. The value chain model, and this is where I really challenged them on a phone hookup. I said, well, under genomics, I'll just take 500 ewes, I'll mate them to your top 33 size, I'll get about 15 progeny each, 500 lambs through the slaughter. I'll talk nicely to JBS, they've got a Dexter in at Bordertown, so I'll go do that, and I'll get basically 500 lambs, I'll genotype those 500 lambs, I'll spend $50 on getting eating quality sampling. For $42,500, I can do all of the carcass genetic data that you wanted to in your breed, as well as adding all of the eating quality data in your breed, and I can do it for $10,000 less. And all you guys have to do is take the information from the genomic evaluation program and just put it through your breed. Makes sense, doesn't it? Pretty simple, right? Imagine my surprise when there was only one breeder that was excited and the other 39 were completely upset, right? But that's the quantum shift that genomics can do to a particular breed. And you could run exactly the same model across a beef breed, and again, you get exactly the same reaction, except it's a little bit more serious. So the red meat profit equation, the final part of the equation that I look at, you've got this dollar return, yield versus value. As Tom said before, hot carcass weight, fat score and P8. We're going into a situation where we're going to get all this commercial data coming from DEXA, coming from eating quality. The challenge for industry is, do we accept that commercial data has value? Will the seed stock industry accept that commercial data has value? Right? And will they allow that commercial data to influence their selection decisions? Because it's not collected in the seed stock industry anymore. The real data for future genetic evaluation is going to be collected in the commercial sector. It is now no longer going to be collected at the seed stock level, so who actually values that information? Because now you're only paying the seed stock breeder to basically change their genetics. All of the information collection will be in the commercial sector. So how much is that going to change the value of bulls and rams in the commercial sector? A really good question that I hope a few people are thinking about. So all these data sets, everybody's seen them there. I've been there. I was talking to Lucinda before this presentation, said, 10 years ago we had exactly the same thought. 10 years ago we thought it'd be really simple to whack all of those databases together. Rod summed it up. I think he's a little bit optimistic. It was 261 animals went in that year that he was talking about. It just makes sense to do that. It just makes sense. A red meat data hub, that's a virtual data hub, is going to be completely essential for the industry to move forward and for efficiencies to be returned across the whole industry. How it's operated, what rules are there, who puts data in, who pulls data out, who makes choices, I don't really care as long as there's a will to do that. Because if we don't have that will, we're all going to be basically piecemeal accepting of the changes that Jason mentioned. Because someone else is going to do exactly the same, and maybe if we don't do that, and Ireland is, then maybe in 4 or 5 years' time, we'll be buying semen out of Ireland, right? Because their rate of genetic change has been so much greater than ours that they will be so much more competitive than us. So if we don't, expect some other country will, or some other industry will, and expect that we'll be paying for their genetics rather than using our own. So in summary, Brand specifications are going to change the whole requirements of genetics, and there's going to be much more of these supply chain traits moving through the marketplace. I spoke a little bit about marbling. Imagine the consumer impressions when we start talking about iron and zinc and omega-3s and all of those other things that modern consumers are going to demand. So if we're going to talk about traits that we can't see, then we'll need a modern evaluation program to handle those traits, right? And that, again, is going to further challenge us. The disconnect between market signals. There's an end user, the consumer, and the consumer couldn't really care about all of those other traits that we have to select for, except for the fact that they want a piece of steak or a lamb chop on their plate that satisfies their eating quality experience. That's the only thing they're paying for. The rest of it, you're putting into a production system to get to that outcome. So are the consumers really paying for the rest of that? Probably not. How you relate what you put into that versus what you do with the consumer is going to be completely up to us, but it will drive ultimate profitability in the red meat supply chain. And if we are using the wrong genetics or we're selecting the wrong genetics, then we're losing value across the industry. So who's paying that $5 million in that one particular beef example? Who's paying probably the $4 to $5 billion that we're losing across the whole value chain at the moment because our signals are not right? Who's actually paying for that? Because the consumer's not paying us more for that, we're losing that. So the whole is paying for the loss that varies between the stud breeder and the consumer. So as Rod said earlier on, genetics starts off at 100% and gets less, we stuff it up. Well, the more we stuff that up, the more everybody in this room is paying, right? The more we stuff it up, the less we actually get out and the more we lose. So unless we get that cultural change of market signals working right the way through, unless we get those back up to the really good stud breeders who are making informed decisions, then we all lose in the current environment that we face. Thanks very much.